Welcome to this gigantic review of Cyberpunk 2077. Just a quick word on spoilers. The footage I have captured in this review features a very small sliver of a couple of main story missions right at the start of the game that has already been shown in pre-release gameplay footage by CD Projekt Red. The rest of the video is very minor side content and a small amount of footage from a more major side mission that I've carefully edited to not contain any sort of story information. Also, this video does not represent the performance of the game running on my PC ordinarily. Since Cyberpunk is very CPU heavy, the capture software when recording the gameplay for this video would often cut the game's frame rate in half in certain scenes. Hope you enjoy the video. As I start to write the script for this review, it's been exactly a month since the release of Cyberpunk 2077, and I have just wrapped up the main quest. Cyberpunk 2077 was one of the most anticipated games of all time, if not the most anticipated, and I knew going into it I would always want to write a review for this game. But it was a long road to get to that fateful day on December 15th. And I planned to slowly let myself soak into Night City and its characters. I didn't wait years just to finish it in a weekend. Took my time, immersed myself in the world, lived and breathed it. I dipped in and out of main quests when I fancied it, sometimes spending entire days just chipping in to the side content. Having finished the majority of the content the game has to offer, I feel like this approach was what CD Projekt Red had in mind for the player too. Not rushing the game and giving it time to breathe before tackling this review turned out to be a good decision. As everyone on the planet must know, Cyberpunk 2077 was a contentious launch to say the least, and of course I will be going through a lot of these reasons throughout this review. In the first month, my feelings towards the game oscillated wildly between being upset and submitting to the unavoidable negativity online, to strongly opposing what seemed like the consensus, defending the game, and adoring it. If the launch of Cyberpunk was an earthquake in the gaming sphere, the tremors are now easing off. My opinion of the game more balanced, sitting somewhere between the two peaks of hatred and love towards the product. So now, I'm ready to talk to you about my feelings towards the game, in what I hope will be a more balanced approach to what some of the day one reviews of the game reflected. Please keep in mind that I played through Cyberpunk entirely on PC and have not seen console gameplay with my own eyes. The console versions are a whole other beast to tackle, a beast that I'll have to defer you to another reviewer for. Usually, the reviews in this channel are more freeform, but this is a huge game, and I want to try and tackle each element of the game separately before bringing it all together at the end. With that in mind, I'm going to start off with the surface level appeal of any game, the graphics.
Come on, let me show you around.
The graphics of Cyberpunk are best summed up with the now overused but genuinely applicable term breathtaking. Keanu wasn't lying. Let's just throw the actual NPCs aside for a moment. Night City feels like its own distinct character, living and breathing. From start to finish, there are sections of the open world landscape which are huge and sprawling and epic. Words that seem to be thrown around at every AAA open world release, but Cyberpunk takes the open world landscape to a whole new level. There is a verticality to the world that is genuinely unprecedented. You will often find yourself looking out across a bridge to find yourself staring down at several layers of busy highway beneath you. One particular area of delight, Japantown, has elevators that take you up and down different street layers, with plenty of spots to gawk at just how layered the area is. Food vendors, fireworks, shops absolutely pack the streets. Venture through the thick urban jungle and you'll find yourself in a surreal park under a highway. Take a trip outside of the city limits and you'll find a vast desert. Night City is divided into several districts, each district feeling genuinely unique. The game will tell you when you've entered a new area, but you'll just know regardless. There's a very distinct flavour in each region, and you'll become accustomed to them very early on. That isn't a bad thing either. Night City itself is certainly not the biggest city in pure square kilometres, but it makes up for it with its sheer density. Most of Night City is beautiful. That's not to say it's all good stuff. There were times when I discovered very low textures in areas, most noticeably in this landfill site, where there is noticeable clipping in 2D objects, as well as geometry which is difficult for the player to navigate, where the designers clearly felt the player wouldn't want to venture into. When the graphics looked dodgy in Cyberpunk, it's difficult not to have the immersion slightly broken. Low-res textures and clipping are far from the worst offenders in the game's graphical issues, however. In what you will begin to find is a recurring theme in this game. There are lots of small and sometimes significant graphical bugs peppered in throughout the entire game. Some of these graphical bugs most likely tie into the extremely subpar AI, where the game definitely has issues with attacking from a range. Often enemies would teleport to cover, shake about in a bizarre way, and just in general have janky animations. Even dead bodies fail to behave consistently, with a very large number of enemies dying in contorted, bizarre angles. Weird ragdoll physics are not unique to this game, but I was surprised by just how many enemies would distort to post-mortal yoga positions. I accept that some tolerance must be applied to combat in an open world game, but frankly it felt like there was some sort of visual bug in every firefight. Speaking of combat, what about the guns? Cyberpunk also arms you to the teeth with a large pool of guns. I'll discuss the gunplay later in detail, but from a pure visual standpoint, these are among the most satisfying guns in games in the last decade. Animations are very well detailed, with a lot of different reload animations across the guns. Arming yourself with a new gun will present you with a unique animation too. Guns have a satisfying oomph to them, as thick smoke billows out the barrel in every shot in a gratifying way. There are secret guns with unique gimmicks to find, which is a fun addition to the game, as well as a lot of iconic weapons that are one of a kind. A lot of the iconic weapons were unique in their function, rather than the physical appearance of the gun itself, but there are plenty of exceptions to that. It was generally exciting finding an iconic weapon amongst a mountain of common junk guns. The NPCs are a mixed bag. Some characters are lavishly crafted and rank among some of the most realistic character models I've ever seen in a game. The animation work done through motion capture is superb, particularly in capturing small facial cues. I can't talk about character animations without mentioning Keanu Reeves, who features in the game far more than I realised going into it. Surprisingly, I didn't find Keanu to be as convincingly human looking as some of the other characters. Maybe it's how they dealt with his facial hair? That's not to say his inclusion wasn't great though. It's very clear a lot of work went into making his character. Generic NPCs can look a little bit jarring sometimes though. I won't knock Cyberpunk too much for that. It's a city with millions of people living in it, and it's very clear that the background NPCs are very much just window dressing, moving human objects designed not to be scrutinised too heavily. This design of window dressing is a philosophy that Cyberpunk adopts in several aspects of the game, for better or for worse. It extends to the cars too. On the outside, cars look really great. There's not much to say about that. They're just as good as you'd expect from a game like this. On the inside though, it's clear that a lot of love has been put in. Whereas other games would neglect the internals, Cyberpunk stresses that it is a first-person game, and so entices you to keep that perspective the entire time by giving you a selection of well-designed radios, gearboxes and futuristic gizmos to fully immerse yourself into the world. Of course, I immediately changed the view to third person because that way of driving is ingrained into my mind, but I definitely at least wanted to give the first person a go to see those lavish innards. As I alluded to, just like the divide between main characters and NPCs in the game, there is a divide between cars you'll drive and NPCs. Cars you'll drive and the NPC's cars. Though not as dramatic, it is obvious the game wants you to use your own summonable cars rather than steal something off the street. Cars, like NPCs, are window dressing that do not hold up to close inspection. Distant cars allude to heavy traffic and distance, but if you look for just a second, you'll notice they are 2D textures vanishing in and out of existence. This wouldn't be so bad if it wasn't for the fact that the distant traffic was always so much more dense than whatever you're currently in. Since this is a PC review, I'll talk about performance and graphics settings in here. There are a plethora of options to sink your teeth into on the graphics side, with some settings having quite a lot of granularity. I'm not going to go into too much depth, I would refer you to Digital Foundry's expertise on that front, but as usual in a PC game, there are some settings which will tank your performance for little gain, so I would highly recommend doing a little bit of research and tinkering to get the best results. That advice goes for all games, but for Cyberpunk it's more important than ever, because regardless of what rig you have, this game will make it sweat harder than you're used to. You'll find a lot of talk of poor optimization online, but don't buy into that too much. This is a hard game to run because it looks mind-blowingly good, and you need the specs to fuel that. I will say, however, that you will be a lot more comfortable running the game if you're an owner of an RTX card. The DLSS implementation in this game is essential, and if you're able to turn it on, you absolutely should. On the balance setting, DLSS can double your FPS. To give you a rough idea of performance, I played the game using Digital Foundry's recommended settings at 1440p with DLSS set to balanced. My RTX 2070 Ryzen 3 700X equipped PC got the game running at mostly just above 60 FPS. This game has gained infamy for its bugs and subsequent hotfixes and incoming updates, and I, alongside others, have noticed that playing the game for a long period of time noticeably deteriorates the frame rate the more you play, only being fixed by restarting the game. It's not ideal, but obviously not a complete game breaker on its own. This is something that will undoubtedly improve over the year. One thing I haven't seen talked about enough is the loading screens. There are no loading screens to speak of in Cyberpunk when walking around. You can walk up to the top of a skyscraper, a roller coaster, or out to a deserted house in the middle of nowhere, encounter a high budget cutscene or a boss fight, and you won't encounter a single screen. It's incredibly impressive and enormously helps the immersion of the first person experience, often feeling like a movie filmed in one cut. The only loading screens you will see are when starting the game, travelling, and respawning, and they are extremely short on the NVMe SSD I played the game on. As you have heard during this review, the music hits hard, perfectly balancing the cyber electronic with the punk rock, showcasing a nice spectrum of artists on the radio and a great pumping original score that will inevitably drill into your subconscious. There's a nice dollop of licensed tracks that you can tune into on the 11 radio station whilst soaking in the sights in a vehicle, and a nice variety that also feels realistic in the dystopian setting of the game. During combat scenarios, tense, subdued music plays when sneaking, and the game will let you know very quickly that you've been spotted with a loud siren noise. Get seen out in the open for too long and things get explosive, with an intense theme to accompany, which becomes more severe the greater the threat is against you. If your head is in the sights of an enemy far more powerful than you, the game will let you know with its audio cues. It's a shame then that the AI isn't up to scratch, because occasionally I will be peacefully wandering the streets only to be launched into some heavy techno track warning me of my imminent death, only to find there's nobody near me. It's a shame, because when a bug like that happens too many times, it diminishes the impact of the great soundtrack when it works properly, leaving you with a slight bit of doubt in your mind as to whether you have actually been spotted or not. Environmental sound effects in Cyberpunk are top tier. The guns sound crunchy when they should, and snip quietly through the air when silenced. Cars rev with a tangible power to them. Busy populated streets sound loud and busy. Clubs with thumping tunes realistically transition from music to the background bass as you move into the back rooms. I have nothing to complain about here. Character dialogue is also fantastic. Main and even more insignificant characters are voice acted to a pristine quality and really colour the diverse cast. You encounter the whole gamut of humanity in Night City, and Cyberpunk really does bring them to life in this regard. There is a lot to talk about gameplay wise, so I'm going to break up each of the game's core components into different sections, then once I've covered them, I'll bring it all together and run through a typical session of Cyberpunk 2077. First, the very essence of the genre. Cyberpunk is just about what you could qualify as an RPG. I say just about because it gives you RPG mechanics, but often doesn't know how to properly integrate them into gameplay. In fact, this is the biggest internal struggle I had with this game. If you go into Cyberpunk expecting a life sim, or a deep RPG with intricate systems and vast replayability, you will likely come away a bit disappointed. If you take the approach that this is a game from the same people who made The Witcher 3, and look at it as a step up from the groundwork that it laid, you will be a lot more satisfied. It all starts from the very first menu screen you are presented in the game, choosing a life path. A selection between Nomad, Street Kid and Corpo are given to you with brief descriptions of each. These choices dictate what your character's life has been leading up to the events of the game, and is seemingly quite a substantial choice to make. What you get for your choice is a different prologue to the game, which lasts about 15 minutes, and then unique dialogue options throughout the game. Unfortunately, these unique dialogue options usually only amount to optional additional dialogue that can flesh out a bit of lore for you. Rarely I was able to progress a dialogue with a life path option, but choosing a unique dialogue option never actually changes anything other than how a character responds to you directly after. You could argue that it adds a little bit of flair that other games don't offer, but I would suggest a counter-argument that it actually makes the role-playing feel more restrictive. It gives you the illusion that you have made your own character, but really I think they would have been better off giving the character you play as, V, a predetermined backstory that they could have fleshed out more for the player. The next screen you're presented with is the character creator, and a strangely blurry representation of your character. Once you get over the fact that you can see your character naked, you'll find at best an acceptable character creator. There are no adjustable sliders, just a list of presets for different aspects of your face. Some options, namely with face structure and hair types, have enough variety to please 99% of players. It was fine for me. There are no options for body type, except for a male/female option, as well as the ability to have a male voice on a female body and vice versa. You only ever get to see your body in occasional reflections in an inventory scene. There just seems to be a bit of a disconnect between the character you have created and V. Whenever I actually got to see my character in game, I was almost surprised to see the guy. You spend so little time looking at yourself, the character you create and the voice you hear feel like two separate entities. In a brief scene when you're allowed to see yourself from third person and see the character you make speak, it looks wrong. I had built up an image of a different V in my head to the one I actually created. I believe the game would have been better off if it ditched the character creation altogether and focused on a specifically designed protagonist. It's a shame that this disconnect exists, because the voice acting for male and female V is, like the other characters in the game, fantastic. Clothing options further hurt the game's ability to play a customised character. There are a lot of clothes to choose from in the game. Like the music, it plays up to the game's title nicely, with some futuristic electric lace clothing, to heavy metal denim and skulls, to biker clothes, cowboy cloaks, the list goes on. The problem is there's no way to change the appearance of individual items in order to keep a sustained and matched appearance. You have to make the choice between looking good with terrible armor stats, or looking bizarre but using the very best gear you have collected. The choice for me is easy. If you can hardly see yourself, you may as well dress hideously to get the best gear. This had me withdraw even further away from the V I created, as I tried to block out the awful clashing outfit I kept seeing in the inventory screen, because I knew it wouldn't matter anyway. I might be sounding harsh here. I do think the first person perspective was the right choice for this game. It immerses you in the world and it makes the shooting so much more intuitive. It just feels like the character creation and the rest of the game feel completely separate and at odds with each other. For a game so dialogue heavy, I was expecting something along the lines of Fallout 4 when it comes to combat, just about serviceable. To my surprise, the gunplay is fantastic. I've already outlined the feel of the guns, which goes a long way to making the shooting exciting. Enemies are blown back by shotguns, snipers feel powerful, decapitation is very much in the game if that's your thing, further fueling the grimy atmosphere of Night City. The selection of guns include the usual cast: pistols, shotguns, snipers, assault rifles, submachine guns, light machine guns. There are also offshoots of some of these that are in a different category of their own: revolvers, heavy machine guns, precision rifles, double-barreled shotguns. Dividing these up even further are subcategories, which divide the guns based on how their bullets are propelled. Power guns are your conventional weapons, tech weapons are magnetically augmented guns with unique attributes, and smart weapons can auto-aim on enemies with guided bullets. On top of this, there are plenty of melee weapons at your disposal. The game employs a run-of-the-mill loot system, which separates guns into common, uncommon, rare, epic, and legendary categories, all with random stats based on their rarity and how high a level the area or enemy the weapon from was. Generally, the higher the rarity, the more the added effects, such as poison, fire, etc., the higher the damage, and the more slots the gun has for equipping mods that give more bonus effects. Clothes work in the exact same way. Playing through the game on hard, I found ammunition to be scarce and a lot of the higher rarity weapons to be locked behind vendors at prices far out of my reach. But as with most RPGs, you quickly reach a point where ammo and money is no longer a problem, and towards the back end of the game, enemies start dropping rare and epic items like there's no tomorrow. To combat the late game staleness of finding increasingly rarer weapons, there are one-of-a-kind iconic weapons that spice things up a little and usually feel more rewarding than finding a randomly dropped rare weapon. I found the rarity system to be absolutely fine. The loot drops are on the more generous side overall, but it never felt like the game was just giving me constant powerful guns. Genuine powerful guns were very rarely dropped, which is how it should be. The only issue with this is your inventory space being filled with junk guns you never use, but to combat this, there are drop-off boxes all across the world which let you very easily sell off what you don't need. The looting is something I never had to really think about, which is great. For me, I don't want to have the feeling of always worrying about what junk I'm carrying. There is also a crafting and upgrading system that lets you use components that can be found through salvaging, through endless chests, desks, bins, etc. to make your own weapons and upgrade others. This part of the game feels a little underbaked. Crafting components, particularly rarer ones, required for crafting and upgrading the rarer guns or armour, are not easy to find and very expensive to buy at vendors. By the time I would have collected enough materials to upgrade my current favourite gun, I would have found another, better gun already. The exception to this is if you do invest a lot of time in crafting, there's an entire crafting skill tree to go with it. You are able to create unbelievably powerful guns if you put in the effort. The guns you're able to craft can get insane levels of power, making all combat encounters an absolute breeze. So if you put in the effort, you are being rewarded for it, but being a casual crafter in Cyberpunk is essentially not worth your time. Another aspect that utilises the game's rarity system are quick hacks, which are used for offensive hacking manoeuvres. Relying on guns isn't your only tactic in combat, and there are skill trees entirely dedicated to improving your hacking capabilities, as well as being able to craft quick hacks through the game's crafting menu. Quick hacks can be used on enemies and the environment. Most quick hacks used on enemies are different ways of taking them down. Contagion can start a spreading virus amongst enemies, damaging a group over time, or a more powerful quick hack, suicide, does what it says on the tin. Meanwhile, other hacks can take down or take control of security cameras, or ping an electronic object to reveal other enemies or objects wired into the same network. All of this is tied to two skill trees in the game, Breach Protocol and Quick Hacking, which both expand what abilities you have access to, as well as the speed of hacking and more. Having branches of skill trees, a reasonable selection of hacks, and a crafting system to support all that sounds very exciting, undoubtedly, in the early game. Finding new hacks, if you are building your character that way, is exciting. The problem is, none of it really matters in the end. Going for a pure hacking playthrough would be something I would not recommend to a first playthrough at least. Hacking is not something you can do with unlimited freedom. Hacks take time to reload and be usable again, and each hack requires a certain amount of RAM depending on what you're using. You can upgrade your RAM capacity by upgrading your cyber deck and the rate it refills over time with skill tree upgrades. You absolutely can, eventually, have some seriously powerful hacks that can single-handedly command a battlefield, but I found there to be little incentive when a combination of shooting and hacking is more than capable and no less fun. The same lack of incentive applies to different offensive quick hacks that you find in the game. There are quick hacks that can burn, electrocute, disarm, and poison enemies, to name some, but ultimately none of them really change the battlefield. In the end, they are just all ways of killing enemies in slightly different ways. I hardly touched the quick hacks, despite initially going for a tech-centric character, and by the time I'd reached the final boss, I was still using an unspectacular short circuit hack, and you know what? It was plenty effective against them. The hacks that can be used on the environment are a bit more useful. Stealthing into a building and taking down cameras and turrets, or even turning them against enemies, distracting enemies, opening doors, etc. is all good stuff. I enjoy the stealth gameplay. It's just good though. It is stuff that has been done many times before in games that came out before Cyberpunk, and the implementation here is what I would say is the bare minimum of what I would call acceptable stealth gameplay. Of course, Cyberpunk stealth is below acceptable because of the AI of the enemies. I'll be getting to that. On paper, body augmentations sound pretty exciting. In a game as big and as graphically stunning as Cyberpunk, the game could have gone absolutely to town on this. Earlier, I discussed the character animations in the game, which are often jaw-dropping. I've described to you and shown you Night City's gorgeous details and exhibition of different aspects of humanity. So, in the opening hours of the game, after you're treated to a brilliant scripted sequence of receiving new implants from a backstreet cyber surgeon known as a Ripdog, you know you're in for a treat. Unfortunately, augmentations, or cyberware, are one of the game's biggest missed opportunities. Despite clearly being a huge part of the Cyberpunk ethos, the story and the characters, the body modifications still manage to feel like a complete afterthought, gameplay wise. Visiting a Ripperdoc brings up a menu displaying your body. On this menu, you can run through different upgrade categories, such as your immune system, skeleton and hands, and browse through different upgrades with the same rarity system that's used on the loot that you find in the game. The first thing you'll notice is that most of the upgrades are simply percentage increases and incremental boosts to your stats, which is disappointing but to be expected. Not all of the upgrades are like this. Hanged upgrades can give melee players gorilla arms and mantis blades for dramatic enemy takedowns. Some leg upgrades can improve your maneuverability by augmenting the way you jump, with double jumps and charge jumps. Once you've chosen your upgrade, assuming you have enough eddies, the implant is yours. As in, it's now a part of you, just like that. No cool animation of it being implanted, it's just there now. The first time I bought a Cyberware, I had to double check that it had even been installed. I was really expecting something. The jumping upgrades do amount to new ways of playing the game. Having the ability to double jump did genuinely transform combat encounters as I zipped across the battlefield, soaring into elevated platforms above enemies. Or, even more satisfying, the double jump turned my stealth heavy character into the perfect cat burglar, able to complete thievery missions by finding some creative entrances and getting in and out quickly without ever being seen or even needing to engage with an enemy. One particular highlight was a gig where I had to infiltrate a warehouse surrounded by enemies that was in a clustered area with other warehouses. This isn't unique, by the way, almost all the gigs ask you to do this. This particular area, however, allowed me to backtrack to a building across the road and, using a double jump, clamber my way over into an open window across some pipes. This doesn't happen often, but it does highlight the potential of the augmentations and movement in general in the game. Other augmentations, Mantis Blade, Gorilla Arms and Nanowire, are essentially different forms of melee attacks that function identically to any other melee weapon, with the exception of the Nanowire, which is a ranged melee weapon hybrid. They display fancy animations, proving that you do indeed have augmentations under your skin. There is no real purpose to them other than filling a checklist of arbitrary features that must appear in the game because they were in the marketing. As for the percentage increase mods, there's not much to say here. Sure, they make your character stronger, but it doesn't feel like you've just implanted metal into you or taken out your eyeballs and replaced them with new ones. You're just a little better than you were before. Except for the melee upgrades, augmentations do not change your character's physical appearance at all. Considering the game is full of practically robotic humans, the Maelstrom Gang and character Adam Smasher being highlights, you are unable to join the ranks of them even if you are fully decked out with the most elaborate cyberware the game has to offer. This of course all funnels back to the almost non-existent role-playing in the game, making cyberware feel like just another inventory menu with less flair than clothing, and there's no visual difference to speak of. I don't have tons to say about Cyberpunk's character movement, but it does warrant its own section to briefly discuss it, because it is something that can get easily drowned out amongst the backlash of other aspects of the game. Unlike its contemporaries, Red Dead 2, Fallout 4, Witcher 3, Cyberpunk's movement is a lot more fluid, and the environments you find yourself in are very forgiving for even the more adventurous players. Except for the edge of the map, nowhere is really out of bounds. If you can find a way to get somewhere, the game will have a walkable surface waiting for you. This isn't 100% true, of course. There are fake surfaces where players modded themselves into buildings, but for most players, you will truly be able to clamber around wherever you want. V will happily grab onto most objects, some quite surprising to me, like the top of lampposts and other unusual geometric shapes. I found the fact that V barely struggles or clips through objects to be surprising, especially since NPCs get stuck quite often. This level of parkour makes certain stealth encounters, as mentioned earlier, feel like you're a ninja, and that was very enjoyable. This obviously extends to traditional open shootouts, with V effortlessly vaulting over low objects and clambering his or her way up anything reachable. This level of manoeuvrability, combined with the surprisingly solid gunplay, makes combat feel incredibly fluid. In the game's prologue, you are presented with a dramatic, if a little stiff and glitchy, car chase, where you can shoot out the windows at oncoming enemies. It's fairly well done, and at the very least gets you excited for all the dramatic car chases to come. Except they don't really ever come to fruition. Turns out, there are only a handful of very scripted car chase sequences in the entire game. It dawned on me, many hours into the game at that point, that I had no idea how to initiate shooting out of a car window. Turns out, you just can't. A few hours into the game, a side quest is available that puts you in a series of street races across Night City. The races are a classic setup. Your car races to be in the top 3, whilst the game paints a breadcrumb trail of gates to pass through to show you the correct route of the race. Perfectly fine and inoffensive so far. I certainly began to enjoy the first race quest, until I looked behind me, because despite thinking I had a clear lead over the other racers, they were directly behind me. Not just a few either, every other racer was lapping at my heel no matter how well I raced. This AI behaviour is the worst instance of rubber banding that I have seen in a game. It's a technique to keep races feeling exciting and making up a terrible AI. However, I have never encountered such a poor example of the already frowned upon mechanic. It gets worse though. Crash into a car, completely totaling it? Give it a few seconds and look behind, and it'll be perfectly fine right behind you. To add insult to injury, the game specifically makes a point of saying that the race is rough and you are actively incentivized to take out the competitor. As soon as I saw through the driving AI, it didn't take long. The rest of the racing quests were just a bit of a slog. It's a damn shame that the driving AI is so bad, because the cars themselves are pretty fun to drive. Not GTA levels of course, but that's not really an issue because Cyberpunk is supposed to be an RPG first after all. Cruising around the beautiful Night City is great fun at the high speeds you can get to, and driving out in the Nomad Desert is equally fun. Braking is reasonably well implemented, defaulted to handbrake turning on all the vehicles, which is great for dramatic high speed turns in the cobweb streets the game has to offer. I've looked at every aspect of the game's pure minute-to-minute gameplay, but what about that connective tissue? A detailed look at the main map will tell you a lot of what Cyberpunk has to offer. Very early on, the game lets you gaze upon a nice empty quest log. It won't be empty for very long. I haven't played a game in a long time that bombards you with so many quests like Cyberpunk does. Overall, it's great to constantly have things to do. On the other hand, it can be quite intimidating when you first step out of the mega building of V's apartment. But really, the quest system is very well organised, and once you learn how everything is set out, you can really get stuck into that quest log. There's basically 4 tiers of quests in the game, with the top of the hierarchy being the main quests. These are at the top and will always be your default quests that will be guiding you towards, unless you pick a quest lower down in the tiers. Main quests are what you'd expect. Big budget, high octane, and high story. It is a focused sequence following a very specific story. Midway through, it branches into 3 different streams, allowing you to tackle different main quests in any order you like. All the main quests are really what you'd want out of a CD Projekt Red game following The Witcher 3, and often put you in new and fun situations every quest. The main quest line is also surprisingly short, possibly just a touch too short for my liking, but the game does go to exhaustive lengths to distract you from going from main quest to main quest and have a look at what else the game has to offer. Every so often the game will ask you for a length of time to receive a call for the next main quest. What you can do is use the game's time skip function to carry on questing immediately. What the game wants you to do is use the time to chip away your quest log. After finishing the game by slowly taking main quests between long series of side content, I can tell you that the true meat of the game is to be found in the dozens of stories you have to discover slightly off the beaten track. This brings us down to tier 2, the side missions. Throughout Night City you'll be constantly called upon by a slew of weird and wonderful people, usually different handlers in their own districts, calling upon you, a mercenary, to follow out a job for them. The more jobs you can take care of, the higher your street cred rises. The higher your street cred, the more calls will come your way as you unlock more side missions. Some side missions are found only after meeting main quest characters, so whilst I would say that spacing out main characters is a good idea, they shouldn't be sidelined too much as they serve as locked gates for some of the better chunks of content in the game. Side missions range dramatically in length. Some will be one-off excursions with often novel stories to go with them, others have entire quest lines attached to them and are easily as good as, if not sometimes better than the main quest missions. They're so good in fact, that I wouldn't be surprised if they're originally main quests that were taken off that track to keep the main story lean and focused to one specific story. All of the side missions are entertaining though, taking the game into its most comedic highs and very darkest and harrowing lows. Below side missions are gigs, which are extremely abundant. Gigs will appear on the map highlighted for you and designed to be bite-sized in and out missions with very simple goals such as thievery, rescue missions or assassinations. This content is what most people would usually associate with traditional side questing and offer a fun way to level up and potentially find some good loot. Whilst not revolutionary, having gigs separate side quests allow you to know exactly what you're getting into and stops the quality side missions from being diluted with the bread and butter missions. That's not to say gigs are without flavour though. Even though they are small slices, every gig has unique voice acting, sometimes quite a lot, along with a short and often quite interesting story in itself. Below even the gigs are random instances that occur throughout Night City all the time. There are constant muggings to thwart, gang wars to intervene with, and cops to aid. These missions are slightly more involved than ordinary random encounters in other games, in that getting near to them does trigger text to give you a rundown of what exactly is going on, and completing these will net you a small reward from the Night City Police Department. These are the most mundane and weakest activities in the game, but I did find myself getting involved with them a lot in the early game, whilst I was finding my footing, and found them to be enjoyable enough. And that's all you'll be doing in Cyberpunk. There are no GTA-esque minigames and side activities, but that's fine. You play as a mercenary, and you will always be doing mercenary related tasks. That might sound limiting, and whilst it would have been interesting to have at least one side minigame, the gameplay loop of clearing out hideouts and gigs, getting stuck in an interesting mystery in a side quest, and then accessing a big bullet point main quest every so often is actually quite addictive. The gameplay is good enough to want you to keep playing more and you level up and find new loot just frequently enough that I found the game difficult to put down at times. Speaking of which, that brings me on to the leveling system. Leveling up in Cyberpunk gives you 2 points to spend, one on an attribute and one on a perk. Attributes are the game's way of boosting your core stats. They are split into 5: intelligence, body, reflex, technical and cool, all of which can then be accessed to display different branches of skill trees, which cover a web of perks that perk points can be used to buy or upgrade them. The higher your attribute for a given skill, the more perks you will have at your disposal to unlock. So you are also able to level up individual skills while performing actions governed by that skill, such as killing an enemy with a handgun will increase your handgun ability. There are easily over 100 perks, most of which can be upgraded multiple times, so you are able to customise V quite a bit to your liking. There are definitely perks that are a lot more effective than others, with some perks being next to useless, despite sounding like a cool idea in theory. One stealth perk, for example, allows you to be undetectable underwater. This sounds pretty great, and looks like you'll be able to do some fun underwater approaches or some amphibious stealth tactics. However, there are hardly any bodies of water to speak of in the game, let alone in a position that would be worth stealthing into. In fact, except for a very specific quest, I only really entered a body of water once in my entire playthrough, and that was just because I'd missed a corner in a motorbike and plummeted into a nearby river. Was there originally supposed to be more water? Another selection of perks, again in stealth, are all themed around increasing the ability of your poison weapons on enemies. One perk slows poison enemies, which seems useless considering alerting a single enemy alerts everyone in the area to your location. If you are stealthing, you have to instant kill enemies, or you're going to be spotted. Another grants immunity to poison. Like the water, I'm not sure if I ever remember being poisoned in the entire playthrough. I can actually rag on a lot about the stealth perks, which really is indicative of the underbaked stealth system, but I'm not going to do that. There are other skills that have equally unnecessary perks, but I think I've painted the picture. In essence, whilst it does look like a healthy selection of perks is available to you, you'll surely end up going down a similar route to another player who has chosen to invest in that skill. That doesn't make the levelling of perks unenjoyable, there is a tangible feeling of progress most of the time. I will say a potential caveat to that is that I did reach a point in the game where stealthily taking down enemies became so easy that any additional boost to stealth seemed like overkill. If I'm one-shotting people at level 15, why do I need to have a new headshot perk at level 30?
Guys known for operating in the gray zone. No services about working works. Attach more dates for you.
So this is where I want to bring together everything we've just talked about in this review, and where it ultimately doesn't quite come together in a cohesive fashion. I wish it did, I really do, but the actual gameplay experience of Cyberpunk is much shakier than it should be. The interlocking systems just seemingly bursting at the seams and ready to break at any turn. So, you fancy doing a new gig for a bit of XP. You look on the minimap and select a gig. The main quest is already selected by default. You look on the minimap to select a gig. You summon your vehicle from the drop down menu of your current cars. Most of the time this works just fine, but sometimes the vehicle might decide to drive away from you. Sometimes it likes to run you over. As a vehicle summoner, it does the job, but then you see the other cars around it, and it breaks your immersion just a little bit. The AI of the cars kind of hate your vehicle. By default, they will stop in front of it, but often, even after you move your vehicle, paused traffic will continue to be paused. Sometimes you'll find that cars are just painfully awkwardly positioned on the road because the AI just broke. One thing is guaranteed though, when you drive away and turn around, the cars will be moving again, but they will also be completely different cars. Turn back and forward again, and they'll be different cars. This seems to be because the AI is the most painfully basic pathfinding you can get. They are generated only around a small radius of your character, so when you check the traffic not right in front of you, the game has probably loaded in different traffic already. This definitely hurts the immersion, but it's not a game break. As I've said, this game is not GTA, and it doesn't need to be. It's trying to be something different, and that's fine. It's clear that the resources weren't focused too heavily on traffic, instead generating them as a fairly non-interactable visual decoration rather than part of a real, living, breathing world. What is a problem though, is how that extends to the police AI. On the way to the gig that I mentioned earlier, you may well run over a pedestrian on the way. Even in the often horrific Night City, murder and run is frowned upon. If you kill a pedestrian, the NCPD will be alerted and you'll earn a GTA style star, which, like GTA, grows in intensity the more crimes you commit. Unlike GTA though, the police system seems to have extremely short distance AI, which will just pop into existence no matter where you are. Kill a person in their house with nobody around? The police will probably already be behind you. Massacre on the streets? Police cars everywhere. But just as quick as the police arrive, they will also forget about you just 30 seconds after driving away from the scene of the crime. No dramatic pursuit, no Red Dead style bounty system. They'll just forget and move on with their lives. I can't help but feel that CD Projekt Red have gotten themselves into a bit of a frustrating situation with the crime system. Gamers being gamers have trained themselves over the years to immediately probe at the AI to see how it reacts. Everyone will end up killing an NPC at some point. Making pedestrians killable means they have no choice but to implement a police system, lest the player just goes on a murderous rampage, breaking immersion even further when nobody bats an eyelid and tries to stop you. I think, like the character creation system, a bit of restraint should have been issued. If NPCs were non-killable, like Assassin's Creed games, you'd have no need to reveal a dodgy wanted system. It would work in the lore of the game too. V is a mercenary and not a mass murderer. No matter how you play V, you can't get away from the pre-written dialogue and voice acting. V has a good heart underneath the hardened exterior. Some would be disappointed, but it would reinforce that Cyberpunk is its own thing, and player expectations will be set in a more reasonable mould of what the game actually is. Anyway, once you've arrived at the gig, you'll be greeted with a phone call from the local handler and some of that great voice acting and micro backstory that I've mentioned before. The infiltration. Do you stealth it in or go guns blazing? I found that the game does a good job of accommodating non-stealth players into still being able to do stealth, which is emphasised fairly heavily in the game as being the preferred mode of carrying out a mission. I would say though that if you do invest more in stealth than other attributes, be prepared to have to stick with it. My character ended up being an extreme glass cannon, often being one-shotted but consequently being able to take out most enemies with a single shot to the head, especially in stealth. I didn't mind this personally, but I do think that my character was perhaps a little too fragile, given that my armor rating should have probably protected me a little bit more than it was. Every building in Cyberpunk accommodates different entrances. If your body stat is high enough, you can rip open your own entrance through a locked door, or maybe there's an automatic garage door you can hack into if your intelligence stat checks out. Do you have the double jump ability? There's likely an open window somewhere. Pure stealth? If you're careful, you'll be able to sneak just right through the front entrance. Pure guns blazing? Need I say more? The variety of ways you can go about a mission initially seems amazing. And it's not like having these options is a bad thing, but you will eventually find that there is seemingly always an open window on the roof. Always some sort of entrance to rip open or a door to hack. So what the system really boils down to is finding where your specific entrance choice is located and entering. There are rarely any Deus Ex style dialogue workarounds either, so your options remain to be usually exactly the same once you have chosen your specialisation for your V. But having said that, I never tired of the addictive gameplay loop, so it is difficult to be too cynical. Despite the system not requiring any real thinking, it did successfully trick me into thinking I was being clever for finding my way into a building unseen. When in stealth, the AI of the enemies are classic RPG stealth mechanics. They have habits of standing in perfect positions for you to sneak behind them, often standing right next to a container you can use as a makeshift coffin for their dead bodies so you can hide the evidence. You can take down enemies without a weapon by sneaking behind them and choosing non-lethal or lethal takedowns. Now, One would assume that non-lethal takedowns would offer some incentive to do so, a risk reward. I expected a non-lethal takedown would result in enemies getting up a bit later, but in exchange for that, I might receive a bonus to my payment or something. That is not the case. Lethal and non-lethal takedowns are identical from what I can tell. If there is some reason for it existing, in the 80 hours I played, I didn't notice any difference. Yep, there it is, an entire option and an animation to go with it for a non-lethal takedown. There are even weapon mods that make guns non-lethal, but I cannot fathom why that would matter. If it's for role-playing purposes, I suppose it slightly adds to a bit of immersion if you're going for a non-kill route, but let's be honest, if the outcome is the same, it doesn't really make much sense putting it in there. It makes me wonder if this feature did have more to it at one point before being sidelined in the final product. I mentioned putting enemies into containers. As with a lot of stealth games, finding bodies is an important feature of the game, but it's kind of heavy-handed in Cyberpunk. There is a benefit to hiding bodies. If an enemy spots a dead body, making it harder for you to remain undetected. It's not that the system's bad, it's just the bare minimum, as I've mentioned before, for a stealth game. There could have been a mechanic for hacking enemy communications and stopping the enemy from alerting others, for example. Yes, Cyberpunk is not a stealth game, but it leans on the stealth encounters heavily enough throughout the entire game that I was disappointed to not find more new ones. My original build for the game was to be a stealth hacker, using guns only when necessary and taking out enemies silently through the net. This is not possible. Hacking enemies will alert every other enemy, and in the early game you won't be able to one-shot enemies with a hack, so ranged stealth is limited to silenced pistols. Not that I minded, one-shotting enemies' heads off in stealth never got boring for me because the shooting is crunchy enough to carry it throughout the whole game. It's definitely a shame that stealth is limited in this way though. Once you're kitted out with a good enough silenced pistol, you're pretty much sorted for 99% of stealth encounters that you'll come across. So, let's say you're now spotted. The enemies display a red cone on the minimap, and now they will actively pursue you. This is also kind of where the game falls apart a bit. As I have mentioned several times throughout this review, and I do think it's important to stress this, the shooting and the movement in this game are excellent. But it is the only thing that keeps the combat encounters from being absolutely terrible, because the enemy AI is abysmal. At its best, the AI will run straight at you into your bullets with a melee weapon, or staying behind the same cover taking pot shots at you. Snipers are the exception to this rule, where they are clearly marked with a sniper icon and will remain pretty much stationary on a raised outlook, occasionally taking shots. More often than not though, the AI struggles even with these absolute basic functions. Frequently enemies are stuck in walls, struggle to pathfind towards you, jerk and teleport, and magically sprint at superhuman speeds when they're not supposed to do so. A combination of these will happen nearly every combat encounter, and it frequently cheapens what would otherwise be an authentic experience. There is just this weird disconnect between you, the world, and the enemies, and although it's difficult to put my finger on exactly what is causing this all the time, it is very apparent and absolutely shatters the illusion of the really vibrant world that the game presents to you.
Yo, Mr. V, a pleasure.
Dexter Deshawn in the flesh.
There have been caveats in every aspect of this review so far. For every good thing Cyberpunk does, it seems like there are one or two negatives to weigh it down. With the story, however, I'm happy to say that I'm very satisfied. I plan on having a much more rich, spoiler-full discussion on the ins and outs of Cyberpunk's story in a separate video, but as this is a review, I won't be talking about any specific plot points in the game. The first 15 minutes for each life path the game gives you are fine, and feel like an afterthought in some attempt to make you feel like you're making consequential choices. When the game fully gives you the reins though, it provides you with a rich story as detailed as The Witcher. Almost all of the characters exist in a grey area, which CD Projekt Red has gained a reputation for. There are definitely characters that lean more on traditional good and bad, with one character coming to mind that is almost certainly unquestionably bad. but I was happy to find a very strong level of humanity is present in everyone, no matter where they land on the good/bad spectrum, which makes siding or betraying with these characters often very difficult and conflicting. No, there isn't much in the way of very impactful choices in the game, with a lot of dialogue options leading you down the same rabbit hole, just in a slightly different flavour. But once you accept that the game isn't a complex spiderweb of diverging narratives, you'll come to appreciate it a lot more, and there is a lot to appreciate. The game can be really genuinely dark a lot of the time, which makes the occasional comedic or just non-dark quests feel like what they're supposed to be, a glimmer of hope in the claustrophobic dystopian world of 2077. Romancing characters exist in this game. There are a small number of people that will let you explore this, and you will only be able to fully romance them if you have the correct combination of body type and voice type. The romancing system is extremely basic mechanically. This is not a dating sim, but the relationships you build up with these characters in their own side quest chains feel decidedly human, and there is a definite tangibility and believability to the relationship that you build with these characters as you play through the game. And, like before, the romance options all fall into a grey area of morality and show a different side to them the more you get to know them, opening up to you the more they trust you. I can't talk about characters without mentioning Johnny Silverhand, famously played by Keanu Reeves.
Whole thing's fucked up, huh? Wouldn't want to be in her pants.
Whilst his personality does often come across as pretty one-dimensional, the more you explore quests with Johnny, the more he will open up to you and show you a different side to him throughout the game. The voice acting is great, and considering he's an A-list actor, I was blown away by the amount of voice acting he provides. Johnny doesn't just make whips to you in the main story, he is present in practically all of the side missions and even a huge number of the gigs. And Johnny likes to talk a lot, sometimes a bit too much. I ended up saying quite a lot more than I expected about Cyberpunk, and also coming across a lot more negative than I initially thought I would. I think this reflects my frustration towards the game. There is a gem of a game to be found here. I really did thoroughly enjoy my time with it, but it's difficult to wholly recommend it in its current state. I was going to write an entire section of this review dedicated to bugs, but I think by now it's abundantly obvious if you've even remotely been keeping up with the gaming news in general recently. So I won't hammer on about a topic that has been talked to death already. I will briefly reiterate what mainstream games media has been telling you. The game is unacceptably buggy and too frequent to easily brush past it in the minute-to-minute gameplay. What I hope this review has highlighted though is that Cyberpunk is flawed in more ways than just its bugs. Bugs can be squashed fairly easily, but squashing the bugs in Cyberpunk won't make it the 10 out of 10 game I so wish it was. What it needed was a little bit more time to improve nearly every aspect and system in the game. It has a wide pool of gameplay mechanics that are not explored nearly as well as they could have been, and the game ends up being a bit of a jack of all trades, master of none. There are two ways this could have been fixed. Realistically, the game should have been a lot more focused and less afraid of cutting out certain features in order to strengthen others. The character customization is unnecessary. The wanted mechanic is unnecessary. The life path choices are unnecessary. It's debatable whether the game should really have been an open world, but I would say that the enjoyment of driving around for the most impressive looking city of all video games, was too much for me to say that they should just ditch that. The other way, of course, is more development time. There have been plenty of stories come out of the woodwork about this game's development cycle, and I don't have an insight into their finances of the studio. But considering how ludicrously well the game has sold so far, I can't imagine they would have missed out that much by spending more money to turn it into the legendary game I desperately wanted it to be. The characters, story, combat and world of Cyberpunk 2077 is too good for them to allow the game to continue to be dragged through the mud. There are hints of more to come though. Not only are there clues in-game of where potential continuations could lead to, CD Projekt Red have released a new roadmap detailing updates and free DLC to come. There is no mention of expansions coming, which they have in the past said there would be. In an ideal world, I want to come back to this game in 12 months when it's fixed and a fresh new piece of expansion content is ready for me to sink my teeth into.
You brought this fate upon yourself. Don't blame the cards. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that. It's just... You must be very, very careful, V.